Imagine coming home to find your private pool filled with neighbors treating it like a public water park. Sounds crazy, right? But that's exactly what the HOA did to me, and they had no idea they'd just started a war with the state's water commissioner. It started as an ordinary Friday. I pulled into my driveway after a long day at work, looking forward to a peaceful weekend. As state water commissioner, my weeks were stressful, full of endless meetings, regulatory headaches, and paperwork that seemed to never end. My home, especially my backyard pool, was my personal sanctuary. But that evening, tranquility wasn't on the menu. Stepping from my car, I immediately noticed something unusual. Cars lined both sides of my typically quiet street. Kids ran around, screaming and laughing, and parents carried inflatable toys and coolers toward my backyard. Something wasn't right. Anxiety twisted in my stomach as I quickened my pace. Approaching my gate, I found it wide open, swinging lazily in the breeze. That gate was always locked. Now dread surged through me. The scene in front of me was surreal. My private swimming pool, built with years of careful savings and planning, was crowded with people I'd never met. Kids cannonballed recklessly into the water, sending huge waves over my deck. A man flipped burgers on a grill he'd somehow dragged onto my lawn, smoke billowing into the sky. "Hey!" I called sharply. "What's going on here?" Heads turned slowly, eyeing me as if I were interrupting them instead of the other way around. From behind the grill, an older woman stepped forward, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, sunglasses pushed casually onto her head. "Ah, you must be Eric," she said dismissively, offering no apology for invading my property. It was Helen Foster, president of the Willow Ridge HOA, famous for making life difficult for anyone who dared cross her. "Care to explain why half the neighborhood is in my backyard?" I demanded, barely controlling my frustration. Helen smiled thinly. "Oh, Eric, didn't you get the memo? The HOA voted yesterday. Your pool is now officially classified as a public amenity." "What?" I stared at her in disbelief. "You can't do that. This is my private property." "Actually, under HOA Bylaw 32B, Section 4, she recited smugly, "we have the authority to designate privately owned amenities as communal assets if the community lacks sufficient recreational facilities." I knew exactly which bylaw she was referencing. I'd studied every page before buying here. Helen clearly assumed I wouldn't know the fine print, but unfortunately for her, I knew it all too well. "I'm aware of that bylaw," I replied, matching her cool tone. "But it also requires a unanimous homeowner vote, proper notification, and formal approval from the City Planning Commission, none of which you've obtained." Her smile flickered slightly, but Helen was too proud to concede defeat. "Formalities," she scoffed. "It's already decided. Just enjoy the company, Eric. It'll be good for neighborhood morale." "Neighborhood morale?" I shot back incredulously. "You've broken into my yard, brought in strangers, and now you're trying to pretend this is normal," her fake smile returned. "It's not personal, Eric. It's just business." But she was wrong. It had just become extremely personal. I clenched my fists, scanning the chaos unfolding around me. Kids shouted joyfully, but their parents avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with confrontation. Plates of food lay abandoned on my patio, cups floating in the water. My property, my sanctuary, was being destroyed right in front of me, and Helen clearly enjoyed every second of my discomfort. "Fine," I said slowly, keeping my voice steady. "Since you seem determined to ignore the law, let's see how your little party likes the consequences." Before Helen could respond, I walked straight to the pool's pump house. Curious eyes followed me as I opened the maintenance control panel. Without hesitation, I flipped a few switches. Almost instantly, the hum of the filtration pump stopped. The jets quieted. Everyone paused. Within moments, the once sparkling water started to cloud. Murky patches formed as the stagnant water revealed the dirt and debris brought in by the unwelcome swimmers. People quickly noticed the drastic change. A child climbed out, wrinkling his nose as others began to do the same, clearly uncomfortable. Helen's eyes widened. "What did you do?" I shrugged casually. "I simply shut off the filtration system." After all, a public pool requires special maintenance and safety standards, which I'm not obligated to provide. As State Water Commissioner, I should know. Helen paled visibly. "State Water Commissioner? Oh," I said mockingly, feigning surprise. "Didn't you know?" Realization began dawning across Helen's face. Her arrogant demeanor started to crumble. You've knowingly invited the public into an unsafe, unsanctioned, and improperly maintained water source, I explained calmly. I wonder what the state health department will think about this. You wouldn't dare, she hissed through clenched teeth. I think I would, I said calmly. Actually, I think I'll do it right now. I took out my phone, dialing a familiar number. Helen's confidence evaporated completely as I spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Yes, this is Commissioner Eric Taylor, I announced clearly, locking eyes with Helen. I need to report a serious public health violation involving unauthorized use of private property and untested public water access. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Parents grabbed their kids, nervously shuffling towards the exits. Helen stood frozen, her face turning shades of red and white in rapid succession. Ending my call, I stared directly at her. Expect a visit from inspectors first thing Monday morning, Helen. I suggest you explain to them exactly how you justified breaking state law. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For once, Helen Foster had nothing clever to say. As people rapidly departed, murmurs filled the air. Neighbors whispered angrily, confused and alarmed. Helen turned, storming out with embarrassment clearly etched into her posture. But even as I watched her retreat, I knew the fight was far from over. People like Helen didn't accept defeat lightly. She would come back harder, trying to turn the neighborhood against me. The HOA had power, influence, and deep pockets, but they didn't control the state's water. I did. Returning to my house, I saw the wreckage left behind. Patio chairs overturned, grills still smoking, trash everywhere. My private sanctuary was in ruins. Anger rose again, but beneath it, I felt something else, determination. Sitting down at my desk, I began drafting a formal complaint to multiple state agencies. If Helen wanted war, I'd give her one, but it wouldn't just be about my pool. I'd expose every shady HOA practice she tried to hide. My grandfather used to tell me, if you're going to start a fight, make sure you've already won. Helen Foster thought she'd picked an easy target, but she had unknowingly started a fight she couldn't win, and soon she'd find out just how costly her mistake was. As evening fell, the house was quiet again. I stared out my window at the cloudy pool, realizing my peaceful weekend had evaporated entirely. But that didn't matter now. Because starting tomorrow, my job wouldn't just be regulating water. It would be teaching the HOA a lesson in accountability they'd never forget. Helen Foster and her board had no idea what they were in for, but soon they would. Monday morning arrived faster than I expected. By 7:30 a.m., state inspectors were already knocking at my door, clipboards in hand. They examined the pool meticulously, noting every infraction the HOA had created by opening it to the public. Standing off to the side, I watched carefully, satisfied but cautious. You weren't exaggerating, said Jack Reynolds, the lead inspector, shaking his head as he looked at the cloudy water. No filtration, no lifeguards, improper sanitation. This is a public health nightmare. I nodded. Exactly why I reported it. I warned them. They didn't listen. Jack scribbled on his clipboard and sighed. We'll shut it down immediately. HOA is going to be responsible for all fines and mandated upgrades if they insist on keeping it open. I thanked Jack as they packed up and left. I knew this wouldn't be the end of it, not even close. Evelyn Foster and the HOA weren't the type to back down quietly, but I was ready for their next move. It came sooner than I expected. Early the next morning, I woke up to the sound of a truck backing up in my driveway. Peering out the window, I saw a large sign being installed right beside my front gate. I rushed outside just in time to see workers hammering it into the ground. My heart sank. The sign read, in bold red letters, "Community pool temporarily closed due to owner negligence." Anger surged inside me. Evelyn Foster was sending a clear message. She was blaming me for this mess. She wanted my neighbors to turn against me, to make me the villain in their eyes. I stormed back inside and immediately checked my phone. Sure enough, my neighborhood social media group had exploded overnight. Angry posts and outraged comments flooded the forum. People demanded explanations, criticized my supposed selfishness, and even threatened lawsuits. I needed to set the record straight, but first I had to remove that inflammatory sign. Heading out front, I saw neighbors pausing as they walked by, reading the sign and shaking their heads disapprovingly. I wasted no time calling a local contractor. Within the hour, the sign was gone, but the damage had been done. Evelyn had stirred up suspicion, and whispers spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. That evening, I attended an emergency HOA meeting, one I wasn't invited to, but nothing could keep me away. As soon as I entered the packed community center, eyes turned toward me, most unfriendly, some openly hostile. Evelyn stood at the front, holding court like royalty. "Ah, our esteemed commissioner decided to join us," she sneered mockingly. "Maybe now he can explain why he's putting our community at risk." A chorus of muttered accusations rose from the crowd. I stood, raising my hand calmly. "The only risk here, Evelyn, is your reckless disregard for the law. You turned private property into a public health hazard." "Oh, please," Evelyn snapped. "You sabotaged that pool. You're just upset that you couldn't have it all to yourself." A few murmurs of agreement sounded around the room. I knew she had already turned some neighbors against me, but I still had my ace. "You seem confident, Evelyn," I said, addressing the room more than her. "But perhaps your neighbors would like to hear the full story. Did Evelyn tell you that she's violated multiple state water regulations by forcing my pool open without proper safety measures?" Silence followed, uneasy eyes shifting toward Evelyn. She scoffed. "It was a minor oversight." "No, it wasn't," I replied firmly. "Because of her actions, the HOA is facing massive fines from the state. And since the HOA operates on your fees, guess who ends up paying for Evelyn's mistake?" A loud murmur of worry rippled through the crowd. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. "But that's not even the worst part," I continued, pulling out official state letters from my briefcase. "Yesterday, as part of the health department's investigation, water samples from our neighborhood lake were tested. And guess what? They found significant contamination from untreated runoff, another direct violation caused by the HOA's improper drainage system." Now, the crowd began to openly panic. A woman stood, her voice trembling. "Wait, Evelyn, did you know about this?" Evelyn's face flushed deep red, her confidence cracking for the first time. "These are baseless accusations." "They're official state results," I corrected calmly, placing documents on the front table. "In fact, as state water commissioner, I'm required by law to shut down all public water bodies deemed unsafe. Unfortunately, that now includes our neighborhood lake." Outrage erupted instantly. People shouted questions, pointed fingers, demanding answers from Evelyn. "You knew about this, didn't you, Evelyn?" An older man shouted, rising angrily. "You put our families at risk." "No," Evelyn snapped back defensively. "He's twisting the truth." But the crowd was no longer on her side. Homeowners had seen enough. Their frustrations had finally boiled over. They shouted about fees, demanded refunds, and some even called for Evelyn's immediate resignation. But she wasn't going down without a fight. Evelyn stood abruptly, glaring at me with undisguised fury. "You think you've won? You've done nothing but make enemies here. I'll make sure you regret crossing me." Then she stormed out, leaving the room stunned into silence. I exhaled slowly, feeling both relieved and worried. I had won this round, but Evelyn's threat wasn't empty. This wasn't just a fight about my pool or contaminated water anymore. This was a war for control of the neighborhood, and Evelyn Foster wasn't going to give up easily. Late that night, as I was preparing for bed, I heard noises outside. I peered out my window and saw Evelyn's husband, Tom, pacing angrily in front of my property. He pointed aggressively at my home, clearly shouting into his phone. My pulse quickened again. Evelyn and Tom were desperate, and desperate people did desperate things. I wasn't sure what their next move would be, but I had to be ready. I watched quietly until he left, then double-checked my security cameras, just in case. But as I lay awake, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Evelyn Foster wasn't used to losing. I had pushed her into a corner, and now she'd fight dirty. I had the law on my side, but that didn't mean much if she turned the entire neighborhood against me. But then again, Evelyn had underestimated me once already. Maybe she'd do it again. The next morning, my phone rang early. It was Jack Reynolds, sounding worried. "You might want to brace yourself. Evelyn has filed a formal complaint against you with the city, accusing you of abusing your authority for personal gain." I exhaled slowly. I knew this was coming. "But don't worry," Jack said reassuringly. "We know it's nonsense, but you should prepare yourself. She's playing dirty." "I figured," I replied, steadying my voice. "I'll handle it." Ending the call, I looked outside toward my quiet backyard, the pool still murky, a reminder of the conflict ahead. Evelyn thought she had trapped me, but she was wrong. She hadn't trapped me, I had trapped her. She was playing checkers, thinking only one move ahead. I was playing chess, and I had planned every move well in advance. She was about to learn just how badly she'd underestimated me. Because when someone tries to break the rules, especially with the state's water, I don't back down. I double down. And this fight was only just beginning. Within hours of Evelyn filing her complaint, word spread quickly around town. My phone buzzed nonstop with calls from coworkers, journalists, and neighbors asking questions or sharing gossip they'd heard. Evelyn Foster wasn't playing games anymore. She intended to drag my professional reputation through the mud to save her own. The city council scheduled an urgent hearing to discuss the allegations. Evelyn's complaint accused me of abusing my position as state water commissioner to retaliate against the HOA. Though I knew her claims had no merit, the idea that my integrity was under attack stung deeply. On Wednesday afternoon, I entered the crowded City Hall chamber. Rows of residents, reporters, and council members filled the seats, eager to witness the showdown. Evelyn sat in the front row, dressed in her usual polished style, surrounded by her loyal followers. She shot me a venomous look as I walked past. "Let's call this session to order," Mayor Susan Reynolds announced, tapping her gavel. The murmurs quieted instantly. "We're here today to address a serious complaint filed by Evelyn Foster, president of the Willow Ridge HOA, against Eric Taylor, our state water commissioner." All eyes focused on Evelyn as she stood up, her voice shaking dramatically as she spoke into the microphone. "Mayor Reynolds, members of the council," she began, her eyes shining with artificial sincerity. "Our community is under attack. Eric Taylor has misused his powerful position as state water commissioner to intimidate homeowners and sabotage our neighborhood. He maliciously shut down our community pool, intentionally damaged neighborhood morale, and falsely accused our HOA of mismanagement." Gasps and whispers filled the room. Evelyn was putting on quite the show. She continued, "Because of his reckless actions, families are now worried their home values will plummet, and our neighborhood is unfairly facing enormous fines. This is nothing less than abuse of power." A ripple of tension spread. Evelyn's supporters nodded vigorously, while others seemed confused, unsure what to believe. Mayor Reynolds turned her gaze to me. "Commissioner Taylor, would you care to respond?" I rose slowly, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on me. Clearing my throat, I began calmly but firmly. "Thank you, Mayor Reynolds. Let's clarify the facts. Evelyn Foster and the HOA board illegally classified my private property, a pool built and maintained solely at my expense, as a public amenity. They did so without required approvals and violated multiple state regulations." Evelyn opened her mouth to protest, but I continued steadily. "Additionally, upon discovering their unlawful actions, I, as required by law, reported this violation. The subsequent inspections revealed serious health hazards, leading to mandatory closure of the pool. None of these actions were retaliatory. They were mandatory under state law." Evelyn scoffed loudly. "Convenient excuses. You sabotaged the water supply." Mayor Reynolds gave her a stern glance. "Please let Commissioner Taylor finish." I pressed forward, producing official inspection documents. Furthermore, the state investigation uncovered additional violations regarding the neighborhood lake, which the HOA failed to properly manage, creating environmental hazards. The fines issued were the result of HOA negligence, not my actions. The murmurs grew louder. Evelyn's followers appeared uneasy. The facts were becoming hard to deny. The mayor reviewed the papers carefully, her eyebrows lifting. "These documents clearly support Commissioner Taylor's actions. Miss Foster, do you dispute the authenticity of these findings?" Evelyn hesitated, caught off guard. Well, it's clearly biased. Eric Taylor manipulated." Before she could finish, Councilman Doug Carter interjected sharply. "This isn't about bias, Miss Foster. If these findings are true, it's the HOA that abused authority, not the commissioner." A ripple of agreement swept through the chamber. Evelyn's carefully built narrative was crumbling rapidly. Red-faced, she shifted tactics desperately. "You can't trust these documents. Eric controls those agencies. Of course they'd support him." Now she sounded conspiratorial, desperate. I remained composed. "Mayor Reynolds, every agency involved operates independently. These accusations have no basis." After a tense pause, Mayor Reynolds spoke decisively. "Given these official findings, I see no basis to pursue disciplinary actions against Commissioner Taylor. However, the HOA must immediately address the violations and bring community facilities into compliance or face further consequences. The ruling was clear and murmurs of approval filled the room. Evelyn's face drained of color as she realized her attack had backfired spectacularly. She quickly gathered her papers and stormed out, embarrassed and furious. Yet the story didn't end there. Later that evening, while sitting quietly at home, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. Opening the door, I found Gerald Mitchell, an elderly neighbor known for staying neutral, holding a thick folder. "Evening, Gerald," I greeted cautiously. "Everything all right?" He glanced around nervously. "Can we talk inside?" Once inside, Gerald laid out paperwork and financial documents on my kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly. "I've served on the HOA board for years. Evelyn kept me in the dark about a lot of things. After today, I finally took a closer look." I leaned forward, curiosity rising. "What did you find?" Gerald exhaled deeply, pointing to several highlighted lines. "Missing funds, inflated contracts, improper assessments. Evelyn's been manipulating finances for years, lining her pockets with homeowners' money. Our dues have been paying for her lavish lifestyle, vacations, new cars, you name it." I felt my jaw tighten. Evelyn Foster wasn't just corrupt, she'd been actively stealing from the community. "Can we prove this?" I asked urgently. Gerald nodded firmly. "Absolutely, I've documented everything." "But Eric, you have to understand. Evelyn has powerful friends, including city council members and even local judges. She won't go down without a fight." I leaned back, considering this carefully. "Gerald, are you prepared for what comes next?" He looked me in the eye, determination replacing his previous anxiety. "I am. Evelyn Foster has hurt enough people. This has to stop." We agreed to meet with state auditors and law enforcement the following morning. As Gerald left, I realized the stakes had risen sharply. This wasn't merely about my pool or even my position anymore. This was about protecting our community from corruption. The next day, state auditors descended on the HOA office, demanding financial records. Evelyn, caught completely off guard, tried to block their entry. When she realized that wouldn't work, she attempted to shred documents, only to be stopped and escorted out by the sheriff's deputies. News vans arrived shortly after, reporting the unfolding scandal live. Neighbors gathered outside, shock and anger visible on their faces as the truth came out. Evelyn had embezzled over $200,000 from the HOA over the past 5 years, all while claiming to act in the community's best interest. As deputies escorted her into the police cruiser, Evelyn caught sight of me. Pure hatred burned in her eyes. I knew she blamed me entirely, but she had no one to blame but herself. Yet deep down, I knew this wasn't over yet. Evelyn would fight tooth and nail to protect herself and her carefully constructed empire. But she hadn't realized one critical fact until it was too late. By making my pool public, she'd accidentally opened herself to a wave of scrutiny she never imagined. I was the state water commissioner, and I knew exactly how to navigate these waters. And now, I had allies in Gerald and other neighbors who finally realized the truth. Evelyn Foster had picked the wrong battle against the wrong opponent at the worst possible time. But the question now was simple. How far would she go to save herself, and was I ready to stop her? I was about to find out. The arrest of Evelyn Foster sent shockwaves throughout Willow Ridge. Within hours, every local news outlet ran stories about the scandal, detailing her financial crimes and the HOA's abuse of power. But the story didn't end there, not by a long shot. Though Evelyn was briefly detained, she quickly made bail and returned home. Instead of laying low, she doubled down, determined to turn the narrative in her favor. Flyers began appearing around the neighborhood overnight, anonymously accusing me of framing Evelyn out of revenge. Whispers spread, trying to cast doubt on my integrity. I knew exactly who was behind it. One morning, as I cleared flyers from my mailbox, I noticed a crowd gathering near my driveway. Evelyn stood among a dozen neighbors, gesturing dramatically, clearly rallying them against me. I took a deep breath and walked over calmly. "Oh look, here he comes now," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Come to explain yourself, Eric." "Explain what exactly?" I replied evenly. "How you stole over $200,000 from your neighbors." She flushed angrily. "You manipulated the situation to set me up. You abused your power. These people deserve the truth. I turned to the crowd, addressing them directly. The truth is, Evelyn Foster defrauded this community. She illegally reclassified my private property, created a public health hazard, and embezzled your HOA fees. You're paying higher dues because she spent your money on vacations and new cars. A few neighbors murmured uncertainly, glancing at Evelyn for a response. Her eyes flashed, panicked. "He's lying," Evelyn shouted. "He's out to ruin me." But Gerald stepped forward from the crowd, speaking softly yet clearly. "I served on the HOA board for years. I have records proving Evelyn manipulated finances for her benefit. Eric didn't frame anyone, Evelyn did this herself." The neighbors fell silent, exchanging shocked glances. Gerald's reputation as honest and trustworthy was unquestioned. A woman spoke up cautiously. "Is this true, Evelyn? Did you really steal from us?" Evelyn faltered, suddenly at a loss for words. Her carefully constructed image shattered in an instant. As neighbors began confronting her with more pointed questions, she quickly retreated to her house, slamming the door. Yet, despite this public embarrassment, Evelyn still refused to give up. A few days later, I woke to find another unpleasant surprise. The water supply to my home had been abruptly shut off. I called the city utilities office immediately, annoyed but unsurprised when I learned Evelyn had convinced a city worker, one of her old connections, to declare my water line damaged and unsafe. Now, she'd crossed a new line. But Evelyn had forgotten something critical. I wasn't just any homeowner. As state water commissioner, I had oversight of all water permits and distribution across the state. This wasn't a game Evelyn could win. It was a serious misuse of city resources, and she had played directly into my hands. I made a quick call to the state's Department of Utilities Enforcement, explaining the situation. Within the hour, state investigators were at Evelyn's home, questioning her about the unauthorized interruption of a public utility. Watching from my window, I saw Evelyn grow increasingly frantic as investigators demanded answers. When they finally left, she stormed toward my home, fury radiating from her every step. "How dare you?" she shouted, her voice shaking. "You called state investigators on me, over water." "You cut off my water, Evelyn," I said evenly. "You misused your influence with the city. That's illegal." Her eyes narrowed dangerously. "You have no idea what I'm capable of, Eric. If you keep pushing, you'll regret it." "You've already lost, Evelyn," I replied calmly, refusing to rise to her anger. "Every threat, every lie, every manipulation, it's over. The only question now is how deep a hole you want to dig for yourself." She stood there, momentarily speechless before finally turning and storming away, frustration evident in every step. But even now, the story was far from over. That evening, Gerald called, sounding concerned. "Eric, Evelyn's trying one last desperate move. She's called an emergency HOA meeting tomorrow night, saying she has new evidence that you've misused your position. She's planning to turn everyone against you one final time." I sighed, unsurprised by her relentless determination. "Do you have any idea what evidence she's talking about?" "No," Gerald admitted, "but knowing Evelyn, she'll have cooked something up. You need to be ready." The next day, I arrived at the meeting early. The room was filled with anxious neighbors, tensions running high. Evelyn stood confidently at the front, a thick folder of papers in her hands. As soon as the room quieted, she began dramatically. "I have uncovered proof that Eric Taylor isn't the hero you believe he is," Evelyn announced loudly. She held up a document. "These records show he secretly authorized expensive renovations on his property using state resources." Gasps spread through the crowd. Neighbors shot me worried glances. Evelyn continued, enjoying her moment. "He claims I stole money from the community, but look at these invoices. He's the real criminal here." I shook my head, calmly rising to speak. "May I see those documents, Evelyn?" She hesitated, then reluctantly handed them over, a smug smile on her face. I reviewed the papers briefly before turning back to the audience. "These documents are clearly fake. I've authorized no such renovations, and my signature is obviously forged." "Evelyn, falsifying state records is a felony offense." A man in the crowd suddenly stood up, interrupting. "Excuse me, Commissioner Taylor, but I recognize those forms. My brother-in-law works for the city records office, and I know those aren't authentic." Another neighbor called out, "Evelyn, did you really forge these?" Evelyn's face went pale, eyes darting nervously around the room. "No, I received them anonymously. I was trying to protect everyone, but the damage was done. The crowd erupted into angry shouts, turning completely against Evelyn. A neighbor called out, "We've had enough. Evelyn, you need to resign." Now, she opened her mouth to protest, but another voice shouted louder, "Let's vote. Who wants Evelyn removed immediately?" Nearly every hand in the room shot up instantly. Evelyn, visibly defeated, shrank back in humiliation. I stepped forward, addressing the crowd firmly. "I think we've seen enough dishonesty and manipulation from Evelyn Foster. It's time for this neighborhood to take back control. Let's hold an election, pick new leadership, and make sure nothing like this ever happens again." Applause erupted. Evelyn quickly left, her power permanently stripped away. But even as the neighborhood celebrated its victory, my work wasn't finished. That night, reviewing everything that had happened, I realized how fragile our community's trust had become. Evelyn had exploited loopholes, fear, and ignorance to wield unchecked power. It was time to ensure that couldn't happen again. The following day, I drafted new state guidelines for HOAs statewide, requiring stricter transparency, annual audits, and clear oversight for any actions impacting public utilities like water. This wasn't just about Willow Ridge anymore. It was about protecting every homeowner from future Evelyn Fosters. Yet, as I finished drafting the new rules, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Hesitantly, I answered. A cold voice spoke on the other end, unmistakably Evelyn. "You think you've won, Eric, but you haven't seen anything yet." She hung up abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone uneasily. Evelyn was cornered, disgraced, but still dangerous. The battle wasn't over, not yet. Evelyn's threatening call haunted me long after she hung up. I sat alone at my kitchen table, contemplating her ominous words. She'd lost everything: her power, her reputation, even her neighbors' trust. Yet she refused to surrender. I knew Evelyn Foster wouldn't stop until she'd inflicted real damage. But what was left for her to do, I soon found out. 2 days later, a state investigator visited me unexpectedly at work. "Commissioner Taylor," he said grimly, "someone anonymously accused you of tampering with state water reports to benefit private interests. We must investigate these claims." My stomach tightened. Evelyn had escalated this further than I'd anticipated. She'd attacked my reputation before, but now she aimed straight for my career. "I understand," I replied calmly. "You'll have full access to all my records." The investigator spent hours reviewing every file, every permit I'd ever signed. Meanwhile, gossip spread through the office. Co-workers whispered, speculating whether I was truly involved in corruption. Evelyn was attempting to dismantle my life piece by piece, but Evelyn had overlooked something important. I had always been meticulous. Every decision, every report was well documented, transparent, and lawful. After 2 long days, the investigator approached me with a look of relief. "Commissioner," he said firmly, "I found absolutely no evidence of wrongdoing. In fact, your records are exemplary." "Someone clearly tried to frame you." I nodded, unsurprised yet relieved. "Thank you for your thoroughness. Is there any indication who filed this complaint?" The investigator hesitated, then sighed. "We traced the call. It originated from Evelyn Foster's residence." I exhaled slowly. Of course it did, but Evelyn had made a critical mistake. Filing false reports against a state official wasn't just petty, it was criminal. The investigator agreed to submit evidence of Evelyn's false claims to law enforcement immediately. Just hours later, Evelyn was arrested again, this time publicly, with reporters capturing every humiliating second. News crews filmed as deputies handcuffed her, charging her with filing false accusations against a state official and obstruction of justice. Her attempt to ruin my career had backfired spectacularly, but Evelyn wasn't the type to go quietly. Even from jail, she tried to rally supporters, sending messages through lawyers demanding community protests and spreading more false rumors. However, this time, no one listened. The neighbors who'd once feared her finally recognized her for who she truly was: desperate, manipulative, and dangerous. With Evelyn permanently sidelined, Willow Ridge began rebuilding. At a community-wide meeting, residents officially dissolved the HOA's former structure and elected new, transparent leadership. Gerald Mitchell, whose honesty and courage had exposed Evelyn's corruption, became interim president, vowing to restore trust and fairness. Meanwhile, I finalized statewide legislation I'd been drafting. Soon, Every HOA in the state would be required to maintain transparency, submit annual audits, and allow regular state inspections. No other community would suffer the chaos Evelyn had brought upon ours. A month later, I stood in my backyard, staring at the crystal-clear water of my private pool. The water shimmered peacefully, finally free of controversy, arguments, and unwanted intrusions. I took a deep breath, savoring the long-awaited peace. Gerald approached from next door, holding 2 cold drinks. "Thought you'd like to celebrate," he said with a smile. "The legislation passed unanimously this morning. You're officially a hero." I laughed, shaking my head. "I was just doing my job." Gerald raised an eyebrow knowingly. "Eric, your job was to oversee state water, not take down a corrupt HOA president single-handedly." I smiled, accepting the compliment. "I suppose sometimes you do whatever's necessary." We clinked glasses, looking out at the calm neighborhood around us. Neighbors waved warmly as they walked past. Children laughed freely without fear of HOA fines. And for the first time in years, Willow Ridge felt like a true community again. Yet even then, the story wasn't quite finished. A few weeks later, I received a surprising call from Evelyn's attorney requesting a meeting. Curious but cautious, I agreed. In a stark, sterile conference room downtown, Evelyn waited silently. Gone was her polished appearance. Instead, she looked exhausted, humbled, and smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her attorney sat beside her, expression neutral. "Evelyn asked to speak with you privately," the lawyer said quietly, excusing himself from the room. Once alone, Evelyn finally looked me in the eyes. "Eric," she began softly, her voice cracking slightly, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to understand something." I listened quietly, unsure what to expect. She exhaled deeply, continuing, "When I took over Willow Ridge HOA, I honestly believed I was improving things. But then I started cutting corners, taking shortcuts, ignoring rules I thought were inconvenient. I convinced myself it was justified, that I deserved something in return for my hard work. And before I realized it, I'd become the very thing I used to hate: corrupt, arrogant, and destructive." Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, I saw genuine remorse in Evelyn Foster. "I tried to destroy your life to protect mine, but all I've done is ruin everything." I considered her carefully, realizing that behind the corruption was simply a person blinded by power and ego. "Evelyn," I replied evenly, "you hurt a lot of people. You abused your power and violated their trust. Your remorse won't erase that." She nodded slowly, eyes downcast. "I know I'll face the consequences." We sat in heavy silence. Finally, I stood up. "I can't promise forgiveness," I said honestly. "That's for the people you've harmed to decide. But if you're truly remorseful, make amends. Admit your mistakes publicly, pay restitution, and rebuild your life honestly. That's the only way you'll find redemption." Evelyn met my gaze, determination returning briefly. "I will. Thank you, Eric." I left that meeting knowing justice wasn't only about punishment. Sometimes true victory was seeing even your enemy finally recognize the damage they'd done. Months passed, and Evelyn pled guilty. She publicly apologized to the residents, paid restitution, and began volunteering at local charities. Some people forgave her, others didn't. But she kept trying, proving change was possible. And as for Willow Ridge, our community flourished like never before. New leadership brought genuine openness, fairness, and compassion. People gathered regularly, hosted potlucks, shared ideas openly, and supported each other genuinely. Sitting by my pool one sunny afternoon, Gerald turned to me. "Did you ever imagine things turning out this way?" "No," I replied honestly, smiling at neighbors enjoying the new community gardens nearby. "But sometimes a crisis is exactly what's needed to reveal what's truly important." He nodded thoughtfully. Funny how Evelyn's greed inadvertently brought everyone closer together. I laughed, feeling lighter than ever before. "Exactly. And speaking of ironic outcomes, the state government offered me a promotion, Director of State Water Management." Gerald chuckled, raising his glass. "Congratulations. You planning to use that power for good?" I smiled broadly, clinking my glass with his. "Always." I leaned back, feeling profound gratitude. Evelyn Foster had tried her hardest to destroy me, but in the process, she'd revealed strengths I'd never known I possessed. Sometimes, your toughest opponent can become your greatest teacher, and the best revenge isn't simply defeating your enemies, but thriving despite them. And that's exactly what I intended to do.